All right, so we are here talking about Carl Rogers and his book, Freedom to Learn. It's this book right here. We're going to do a several-part series. I'm here with Marsha Enright and Liz Parker. We'll do kind of brief intros. So let me first introduce myself, then we'll go Marsha, then Liz. So I'm Kevin Currie-Knight. I am an assistant teaching professor at East Carolina University in the College of Education here. Marsha?
I am an instructor, and I run a program called the Great Connections for high school and college students that focuses on improving their thinking skills and learning.
Okay, Liz?
Hi, I'm Liz, and I got interested in education because I attended Marsha's program called the Great Connections, and I later learned how to help facilitate Socratic dialogues, and now education is something that I'm really passionate about.
Great. And like I said, we're here reading Freedom to Learn by Carl Rogers. We're going to have some discussions on this online, probably be a 5-part video series, so we want to put them up for anyone who's interested. This video series obviously probably helps if you're reading the book with us, but we're also going to try to make it pretty friendly for folks who are not reading the book but are just interested in maybe Rogers and his educational ideas. So before we get into our takes on part one, this series, this part is on part one. Let's talk about Carl Rogers real quick. Who was Carl Rogers? And then we'll get into why he wrote a book on education. So Marsha, you have kind of a little bit on Carl Rogers for us.
Carl Rogers was a psychologist in the mid to late 20th century, and he was in the humanist tradition, which was kind of a breakaway from what was going on with Freudian therapy and behavioral therapy and other types. He was very much focused on what's the nature of the person, how do you help a person understand themselves better, and what is the actual role of the psychotherapist in that situation. He was an innovator in many respects. For example, he was the first one to tape record a psychotherapy session so that you could listen back, so that both the therapist and the client could listen back to it and see what was going on, you know, be more self-reflective. And he was very influential in his point of view in terms of therapy. He later got into the work in encounter groups, and I think that's related to what he was doing in education.
Sure. Yeah, because Rogers, in terms of his psychotherapy, as you say, was pretty innovative, and it was really about the human-to-human relationship. I think he was pretty big in terms of, you know, psychotherapy's job isn't to fix a person, it's more to kind of help the person be who they want to be, who they truly are, I think was his phrase. And from what I know, I can't even tell you the sources I got it from, but I believe Rogers started working on education because he started to look at the encounter groups that he was running as kind of educational experiences and educative experiences. So he started thinking about the structure of the education system, how this should be different, why we should afford students more freedom in the process, why that would be a good idea. And that's, of course, where this book comes from. So it's all about, in some ways, giving students freedom and how to do that. So part one, to give just a little segue before we get into the questions, part one is really, we start off the book with 3 chapters of 3 people that Rogers knows about, and what he is one of them, who have run classes that give students a significant amount of freedom over over what they're doing, over their evaluations of themselves, things like that. So giving students kind of free rein in terms of what they learn, giving students free rein in terms of how they grade themselves. The grades are used very loosely. We'll talk about that. So we have Nish Shiel, who is a elementary teacher. It looks like probably late elementary is my impression. There's Professor, what was the name? Professor, sorry, help me out. Professor Fa, I think it was.
Fa. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, he's undergraduate, teaching an undergraduate psychology course, and then Carl Rogers teaches a graduate course. So we have 3 chapters that give a description of these classes where freedom is a pretty important element. So let's get into it. I think the first question that we had in terms of our discussion before the recording is what does Rogers mean even by the freedom to learn? So even before we get into these specific examples, what are we talking about? Freedom to learn. What are students supposed to be free from? Let's get into that.
You know, relevant to this question, I wanted to add something about his method of psychotherapy, which was, number one, he never talked about the person as a patient, but always as his client. And that he thought that the person was the expert on what was going on inside of him and what he needed and what his goals were, he or she, and that the psychotherapist was there to help that person discover those things. And I think that's very relevant to what he's talking about in education here.
Sure. So you have, like, let's say Miss Shields' class. First of all, it's kind of interesting that he starts, instead of describing what he means by freedom, he starts off with 3 examples. I thought that was a pretty interesting start. So it's not like the theory section comes first and then the examples. He starts off with 3 examples. So, I mean, maybe in Miss Shields' class, why don't we start there? Like, what are students free from in Miss Shields' class?
I thought it was interesting because he opens up her section talking about how she was facing a lot of disciplinary issues, a lot of student apathy, and, you know, a lot of pressure from parents and, like, I guess the school system at large. So it was just, it just seemed like it was a really, like, bad educational environment, not just for the students, but also for Miss Shields. And he uses a term at one point, I think, where he says, like, the students need permission to learn. So it seemed like in that classroom, they were not learning, and she was trying to teach, but it wasn't working. So that's kind of what I think pushed her into this idea of maybe I should just give them more freedom. So in that sense, freedom, well, I guess it's like you can't force people to care about something. Like, I'm going to teach this to you until you care about it, and, like, that wasn't working. So I guess freedom in that sense was allowing the students to discover themselves what they cared about, and also, I guess, freedom from some kind of pressure from her, and then pressure from the curriculum.
Right. Here's a relevant passage.
Wait, I have a question. So what do you view pressure as, Liz? What pressures?
Well, she talks about how when she introduces this freedom to the classroom, how a lot of people were uncomfortable with it. And she was also really uncomfortable with it because it was something new. But I think the pressure that maybe the students felt was like, well, I have to do this, I have to care about this, and I have to pass, and I have to do it this certain way. And Ms. Shields probably felt the pressure of, like, well, I have to teach, like, I have a responsibility to teach these students and make sure they're learning the things that they need to learn to be successful in the next grade, or, you know, whatever's expected of me from the school board. So I think those are some of the pressures maybe that she and the students were facing.
So what I hear what you're saying is that it has to do with the fact that human beings are so sensitive to what other people want them to be doing, or what external considerations there are, rather than the learning itself. Do you think that's the case, Kevin?
Yeah, I was actually going to bring up, related to that and related to that question, a book that was written by Philip Jackson, possibly the same year. I think this was written in '68. It was written around the same time. It was a book by a psychologist named Philip Jackson called Life in Classrooms. And what Jackson did is he was the first psychologist really ever to just go into schools, hang out there, and write about the qualitative experience, like from student perspective, from teacher's perspective. And one of the things he says is that he refers to what's called the daily grind. And this is like what students learn very early in school. So there's 3 elements. And I think these are all 3 things that we're trying to potentially free students from, or at least kind of in Roger's idea. The first is that students learn that school is about crowd management. You are one of many, and the teachers are one of few, and your job is to kind of go where they tell you to go. And you're like kind of a herd, and you have to stay with the herd. Number 2, part of the daily grind, is that students learn that the teacher is like the bottleneck of the course. If you want to talk, you raise your hand, and the teacher calls on you. The teacher tells you what to do, and your job is to do it. It's this, I mean, reciprocal, but in the sense that the authority comes from the teacher, and then your job is to kind of give back what the teacher wants. And then the third thing is that school is a constant site of evaluation. You're evaluated by teachers, you're evaluated by the school, you're evaluated by other students, you're compared to other students, and your job is to kind of jump through those hoops. So I bring that up because it seems like those three things are in some ways three of the things that Miss Shields and Carl Rogers maybe mean by freedom. We want to free you from these three kind of elements of the daily grind. It's a long-winded answer, but I think that kind of maybe gets to part of the question.
I guess when you were kind of describing those things, what it made me think was that when we're talking about what does it mean freedom to learn, and in those just three descriptions that you gave, it was kind of like, well, it seems like education is not really about learning in those instances. So I think that the idea of learning in the classroom and Roger's idea of learning and what it means to learn is a fundamental difference. Sorry, Marsha, what were you going to say?
I thought Kevin's summary of what goes on in school was from Jackson is, I mean, absolutely relevant, because it shows that there's all these external goals that people are required to follow in school, instead of the whatever internal goals they might have to understand the world. If learning is about learning to understand the world and themselves, it's not the driver in most of these scenarios, right? And I guess I just wanted to relate it to what I was trying to say before, which is that human beings tend to be very sensitive to what other people want them to do and how to conform to that. And so in a certain way, it's really hard to liberate yourself from that and follow what you are actually interested in.
So why don't we talk then about one of the elements that I think all three of the essays, Ms. Shields, Professor Faw, and Rogers have in common, which is the evaluation process. So I think, Liz, one of the questions that you would come up with is, how can you evaluate learning in a course without grades? How can self-evaluation be used to credibly convey to others what the students have learned? And then you talk about how Montessori's idea was a portfolio. Well, let's think about, okay, so Ms. Shields and Professor Faw have different methods that are similar of evaluation and how students are evaluated when they're allowed to basically learn what they want to learn. So what is Professor Shields' method? What is Professor Faw's method? And then we'll talk about, like, is this a meaningful way to evaluate? So Ms. Shields, I think, takes place on page 13, right? She talks about the idea of a work contract. So let's describe the work contract and then how the grade is determined.
Well, on page 13, she says, each child was to write his or her contract for the day, choosing the areas in which he would work and planning specifically what he would do. Upon completion of any exercise, drill, review, etc., he was to check and correct his own work, using the teacher's manual. The work was to be kept in a folder with the contract. I met with each child to discuss his plans. Some completed theirs in a very short time, and she goes on to explain a few more things. Resource materials were provided, and she had much more time, so she worked, talked, and spent the time with individuals and groups.
Yeah, it's a good description. And then I think the final grades were kind of determined in the same way. It seems like it was a co-evaluation between the student and the teacher, like, based on the goals I set for myself, here's how I think I did, here's why, and then the teacher would kind of approve or disapprove or whatever. Okay, so then Professor Faw's method, which I think we have it on page 43.
Good. Is Kevin, I think it might be relevant to summarize the results that she got by doing.
Sure. Yes.
Yeah, so what happened was these children really turned around in their engagement in school, became very interested in what they were doing, and also self-disciplined in a certain way, in the sense of since they were interested in the projects they were doing and they were evaluating themselves, they were much more engaged in actually working all the time in class and interacting with each other. And she had more time to help individual groups or or individuals, because she wasn't having to tell everybody what to do anymore. She ended up turning the class had an amazing turnaround, and it was a very successful experiment, apparently.
Yeah, yeah. She also notices in, I have it listed on page 19, but I'm not seeing it. As I went through the process of putting grades on report cards, I began to realize the most valuable aspect of children's growth could not be evaluated in terms of letter grades. For some, there is no observable change, or it is intangible. Yet one senses growth, a metamorphosis taking place. But she also mentions that they were actually pretty self-critical, that they would actually give pretty fair evaluations.
Yeah. And so what does that say to you? I mean, in terms of your own experience as a person learning.
What do you think, Liz? Does that say anything to you in terms of once you take the grading off, it seems to be students are really pretty accurate at self-assessment?
Well, yeah, I think he talks about, and also you mentioned this, Marsha, like when that internal locus of evaluation and like when it's self-initiated, students care a lot more about what they're doing. And I think at one point she even talks about how like it gets rid of that need for like that subversive behavior of like, you know, sending notes and cheating and lying about things and like, you know, just making things up on work, because all of that's unnecessary. And like students can meet in groups or talk to each other if they want to. And also because it's self-initiated and they created their own goals, you're less likely to want to cheat yourself. I think it's kind of how it goes. So it seemed like they were more interested in their own development, whereas before it was not really up to them. It's not really in their hands whether or how much they develop. It was kind of determined for them.
Well, and what's kind of interesting is your description, Liz, of how they don't have to be invested in cheating and taking notes and all this kind of thing, gives them a lot more time to actually pursue what they're interested in, because they're not coming up with these strategies to counter whatever goals other people are setting for them.
Yeah, I was really struck. Sorry, I was struck by her description of students choosing what to learn, because when I think back on my public school experience, like I graduated school, like high school, not really even knowing what I was interested in, because I never had the chance to choose. Like maybe I choose an elective or two, you know, but it's still like it has to be a language or it has to be like an art or a fine art of some sort. So I feel like Rogers also talks about this, about like knowing yourself and creating the self-awareness and like self-driven like motivation to accomplish things. And I thought that was really a really cool outcome of this added freedom in the classroom.
Now, from a historical and kind of philosophical perspective, there's been some writings about grading and kind of how it originated, the A through F, you know, marking system and all this. And basically the message of a lot of this is that there's like two possible rationales. There's two possible objectives for grading. There's two possible reasons. The first is purely an informational reason. So if you want to get better at something, I and you, if I'm the teacher and you're the learner, need to know how far you are towards the goal, and grading serves that purpose. So that's one purpose. The other purpose is, I kind of call it motivational. It's a motivational goal, but it's also like it's gonna be the wrong word, but almost like a punitive goal. So there's another purpose to grading, which is to motivate you to do better, and also in some ways to motivate you by saying, not only am I going to give you a grade, but the grade will count towards something. It'll count towards your future. It'll count towards your GPA or whatever. And these are two really different goals. And the history and the philosophy say that those goals, in fact, are sometimes at odds with each other. Because if part of the goal is for you to just get information about how you're doing, you need to learn. You try to learn and then be okay with failure, and then say, okay, what can I learn from that, and then do it again. But if the goal is that grades are a motivator and possibly punitive, you have every incentive in the world not to want to fail at all. So your goal now is to get a good grade, not necessarily to learn the material. So like one of the ways I put it to students is think about like, your number one hobby. You're probably not afraid to come up short if you do that particular thing. If you're a gardener, you're not afraid to like come up short because you can always say, okay, I can learn from that, I can move on, it's not going to affect my future or whatever. But let's say that I gave you a grade for it. I said, from now to the end of next week, your job is to plant this field perfectly, and if you don't, I'll take $500 from you. Or, like, your incentive structure has now completely changed. Your goal is not to learn how to garden. Your goal is to not have $500 taken away from you. And that's a little bit different. Like, we like to think that those coincide, but now your goal is towards the grade, not towards the learning. So that's the way I usually like to think of it.
So usually, don't they talk about that in terms of an external motivation versus an internal motivation?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It maps well to that, yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
The interesting thing to me is the implication that the felt need that authorities, whomever, have to create such an external motivation system implies that human beings aren't naturally interested in learning. You have to prod them somehow, right?
Yeah.
But I think Rogers is taking a completely different attitude towards it. I mean, at some point, and one of his books that I read, I think it was in Becoming a Person, he talks about how each person, well, first that he is an Aristotelian, especially in the biological sense, and that he sees each person as like a flower that has a lot of potentialities, and whether that flower blossoms or whether it becomes distorted depends on what kind of environment it's in and whether its inner potentials are released. And I think it's applicable to this situation here. Sure. In his classroom.
Sure. Yeah, and then Professor Fall also found, that his students did pretty well in terms of setting goals and trying to reach those goals because they were, the students' goals. So on page 43, if we talk about Professor Fall's method and how it's pretty similar to Ms. Shields' method, they take the students' goals and then the professor kind of co-evaluates with the student. On the bottom of 43, it says, for method of evaluation, the main principle agreed upon by all instructors for this section is the evaluation will be in terms of the quality and quantity of what has been produced during the course in pursuit of self-directed goals. So like the professor is giving permission to say, you choose your own goals, set your goals, see if you can reach them, and evaluate yourself based on those goals. And I will make sure that my evaluation of you is based on your goals rather than my goals for you. I think one of the questions, I believe it was from Liz, is that you said, why does providing freedom to students through self-directed methods pose such a dangerous idea? And I think this kind of gets to that, because I can totally hear like colleagues and critics and things saying like, but you're the professor. You're the one who knows what mastery is. So if you leave it to them to evaluate themselves, they're never going to know whether they've gotten mastery. That's your job. So it's like you're abdicating your job to them. Like, what is a response to that?
Well, when Marsha was talking about, like, you really have to have trust in the students to do something like this. And I think that is that's kind of fundamental to this, is because you're really entrusting them to learn on their own. And like, I think you also mentioned this, Kevin, earlier, that the role of the teacher is really changed in this, where the teacher is not just someone who imparts or is the master of knowledge who's going to provide it to students, but the teacher then becomes a facilitator of learning. They become a resource or a colleague, and they share their interests. They're a participant with the student in their learning. But I think you're right. It's like when you're advocating for more freedom in the classroom and for more self-direction, you are kind of like taking the role of the teacher out And I think maybe that's what's challenging, is you think that like, but how do you know that they're going to learn what they're supposed to learn? And I think what Rogers points to is that, well, how do we know what everyone is supposed to learn? And is that the best way for them to learn what they need to learn anyways, that this one person tells you what it is? But I mean, even when I think about, well, don't give grades and let students do what they want, it does sound kind of scary. And I think even the students, and Rogers himself in his course, when he designed it, he wrote that he had to kind of frame it so that it appeared to be somewhat structured, so that students would be less resistant to it. So I think it is a kind of dangerous idea to both teachers and then also to students, because it's, I mean, as crazy as it is, it's so new to people, whether they're young students or older students. I mean, from your experience, Kevin, because I know you have a lot of experience in education, what was it like for you when you started implementing more freedom into your classes?
Yeah, so I have a few college courses right now, and I've tried to design them more and more so that there's very little direct instruction. There's a lot of student choice. And I wanted to bring up, actually, you know, based on that and my experience with it, first of all, from the teacher's perspective, it is kind of awkward because, I mean, first of all, everyone in the room knows that you're the professor. You can't hide that. You shouldn't hide that, because if you tried to, it would be lame to, like, pretending what everyone can't already see. So it's always hard to be like, okay, but what do you all think? What do you think of this? How do you want to do it? Because students will ask you questions and they want your answer. And to be frank, the first several weeks, one of the things I have to focus on is students don't believe you. Like when I say, no, I want you to do your thing your way, and I'm going to adapt my expectations to yours. They're like, no, what do you really want? Like, you're keeping something from me. I know you are, and I'm going to sniff it out. And I have to just like show them. Like, I'll show them examples of past students' works and be like, look, I had no expectations of my own for this, other than that you would do work on it. I don't know, Marsha, have you had any similar experiences with that?
Oh yeah, I see that a lot. Every time I start, well, when I run my course, I always interview all the students before they get accepted to the course, and it's always, and I know that they're sitting there trying to figure out what I want to hear to get accepted, you know. So I try to ask them out of left field questions, just in the sense of, I just want to get to know them and get a sense of what kind of person they are, and if they will actually commit themselves to working in the course, because I know that most of them aren't going to understand what we're going to do until they get there. And then we've had students who get there and they think that they're in a traditional class, and they think that their job is to summarize the text and say back to us what the conclusions are. And what happens over the week is slowly we keep asking them questions about, well, what do you think about this? I'd have to go into how the method works. So it's interesting to see what happens is, often what happens is their roommates will finally say to them, hey dude, you got to do it this way. And then what happens when the person finally gets the idea that the way they're supposed to be discussing things is supposed to be driven from their own actual interest in questions about what does this work mean, you see a transformation in their personality. They suddenly relax and they act much more enthusiastic and almost childlike in a very good way when that happens.
Right. I know one of the other things that's been awkward for me, and I don't think Professor Foss said anything in particular about it, or Ms. Shields. Really, I know that Ms. Shields got some kind of blowback from colleagues who didn't quite get kind of, well, how are you teaching them and stuff like this. So one of the things that I feel kind of pressure on myself, and colleagues kind of have hinted at, is that look, one of the purposes of college education and high school education and down to elementary is to certify that once you get this course, it means you know this, that, and the other. And the problem with doing it in the kind of more free structured way where students pick what they want and you adapt your standards to them is that it's almost like the university and the schools serve two functions, at least two functions. One is that it's a place for students to learn stuff. But number two, it's a place to certify to others that students have learned particular things. So it's really hard, and like there's a pressure to be like, I can't pass a student unless they know this, that, and the other. Like for courses that I have learning goals that are part of the course that are not up to me to choose. And the best I can say is that I'll try to give students some exercise where they can demonstrate that they've learned some of these learning goals, but I can't guarantee to the state that they've learned all of them. I hope no one in the state is reading this looking at this right now, but so that's a tension there, I think.
Well, I suppose to the extent that you can create the activities in a way that the students invest in learning, so that the activities reflect what the learning goals, what are needed for the learning goals, but they're created in such a way that the students can be personally invested in it, then you can achieve both goals. That's not always possible, but sometimes.
Yeah, I guess maybe an important thing to really bring in here, and one thing I love to tell students is when they hear me talk about freedom in education and the wealth of data that says autonomy is just one of the single best motivators you can have, is they say, well, students need some sort of structure. And I always try to point out to them that it's never just freedom versus structure. There's always some constraints in freedom. Like there's never a case where you're completely free to do anything, just anything. Even if I tell you you're free to do anything, there's obviously going to be limits to what you can do. Maybe limits by law, and maybe limits by physiology and gravity, but like every one of these teachers had some structure. Like Miss Shields still had a structure where you write out your goals for the day or for the week. You do them. And Professor Faw had certain structures about how groups are to be formed and how they're supposed to kind of decide on certain things. And Montessori education has certain structures built into it, even though students are largely free within those structures. And same can be said for even something as radical as like a Sudbury school, where there's no curriculum at all. So I think that's probably something important to point out here, is there's always some sort of structure. And Rogers is very careful to say throughout the book, I'm not advocating for one method here. Like there's different combinations you can have. Yeah. Well, let's, one question that I had that kind of concerned me comes from page 38 and 39, where we're talking about Professor Faw's psychology classes. And he really says several times that in his syllabus, that one of his goals is to maintain his own interests. So like, I'm a researcher, I care about certain things in psychology, like part of my job is to maintain my own interests. So he talks about the responsibility of teachers and students. So starting on 38, he talks about, very bottom of 38, the instructor is engaged in research, talking about the things that interest him, reading journal articles and books, etc. In short, he is not putting on a show in the class, he is engaged in real activities, etc., etc. And then on the bottom of page 39, or towards the bottom, I'm sorry, the middle of the page, he says, the instructor therefore is responsible for maintaining his own interests, comma, providing facilities for students to express and realize their goals, comma, but he puts pursuing his own interests first. And I guess one of my concerns is that when I envision Professor Faw's class, I feel like there's a whole bunch of people who are pursuing their own interests, including the teacher, and they're all just like, they happen to be in a room together. And the professor's over here doing his or her thing, and the students are over here doing each of their individual things. I mean, first of all, am I reading that correctly? And second of all, do you feel like the professor's goal, first of all, should be to support students and then to pursue their own interests, like in the after time? Or do you think pursuing your own interests is like the most important thing for a professor or a teacher?
Liz, what's your experience as a recipient of this?
Well, I'm reminded of one of the best pieces of advice that I got in college was to choose professors and not classes. And I think this was the best advice that I was given, because I ended up having amazing professors, and they were in courses that I thought I would not care about, like labor economics, boring, but I had an amazing professor, or microeconomics, so, like basic, but I had an amazing professor, and I think as you were reading, Kevin, what made it interesting was that the professors were interested in what they were teaching, and they were passionate about it. But yeah, Professor Baugh's structure of his course I thought was really interesting because he provided slots and dates and times for students who can come and give presentations, and the professor also would come and give a lecture and or schedule a time slot in which he could lecture, and students could come if they wanted to listen to it, but if they were engaged in other things that were getting them towards their goals, then they didn't need to show up. But if they thought it was valuable, then they could show up. So in that sense, I think that genuine aspect of the professor's engagement with the class is really valuable. And I guess in a university setting, I can see how it makes more sense because, well, the students are engaged in their own research and they're reading and performing experiments, on their own. And so in that sense, the professor becomes kind of like a mentor or a useful colleague or a more experienced colleague. So that the professor's role is kind of changed, but I guess I don't necessarily see how it translates to younger classes or younger students. But I mean, I guess when I think about having a teacher or a facilitator pursuing their own interests, I guess what first comes to mind for me is that aspect of genuineness that Carl Rogers emphasizes in his therapy and also in his encounter groups. But I don't know if that's any more clarifying or if there's a conflict between the goals of students pursuing their learning versus the teacher pursuing their interests.
Mm-hmm. I was thinking that one of the things that conforms everybody together is that it is a course about something particular. So if the teacher is pursuing his own interest, I'm assuming, I think that's what they mean in this description, that the teacher is pursuing an interest in the material that they're studying for the course. And he's trying to answer his own questions about the subject matter that they're studying. And so in that way, he's not just going off and reading up on racquetball or something. He's keeping his mind on the same subject that the student is. And then going back to what you said, Liz, in that way, if he or she is actually interested in what he's studying and he's pursuing his own questions about it, he becomes a role model for the students.
One of the things that I have trouble with in terms of Carl Rogers, I don't think I follow him here. He says in this book and his other books, kind of in therapy and education, that one of the most important things is honesty. So for a therapist to be very honest with the client and for teachers to be very honest with students. And I think following your own interests is probably part of that. You have to be honest that these are my interests, I'm following them. You can follow yours, I'll follow mine, etc. And the reason I don't know if I get along with that is because as a teacher, even if you're a teacher who really is much more of a facilitator and a designer of an experience, I feel like the teacher's role is somewhat analogous to a coach. So I've seen a lot of coaches, baseball, football coaches talking about my job is partially to motivate my people. And I know that my people are motivated in different ways. So I have to motivate people in very different ways. And I have to kind of keep a community feel together. I have to do all this, but that's more of a support thing. If I think that a student, if I think a student's interests, I don't even know how to say it. If I believe that a student is not doing something up to, let's say, my standards or something like that, is my goal to be honest with them, or is my goal to try to almost, I don't want to say covertly, but in some ways it is covertly, kind of motivate them in the same way a coach motivates a player? This may not be me being honest, but this is me in some ways acting so that I can try to motivate you the best way that I think you can be motivated. Does that question even make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think Ms. Shields even wrote something that made me kind of question the same thing about, students who were already having a lot of behavioral issues before she implemented this new kind of freedom in the classroom. And then even once they started the self-directed method, sometimes she would see maybe they're not doing anything, or she would have to remind herself that, oh, well, they weren't producing work before anyways. So maybe they're just thinking or taking the time that they need. But I have that same kind of discomfort that you feel, is that, well, what about, what if they're just not doing anything? Then what is my role? Would the teacher role be to tell them, well, I really feel that you're not living up to your potential, or you're not working towards your goals? Or would you trust the student to make an honest self-evaluation at that point? And I mean, part of the freedom in the classroom is that you entrust the student that they have their own motivations and that they're going to follow them if you provide the right kind of environment for that. But in that kind of situation, I feel that same kind of uncertainty that you do, Kevin.
Well, what do you two mean by being honest?
I know what Rogers tends to mean. I think it was from On Becoming a Person, is when you have a certain emotion, acknowledging the emotion and possibly, letting the emotion out if you have a choice between being honest in your expression of the emotion versus keeping it back, maybe strategically. So if I come into class and I'm just having a really crap day, I could do one of two things. I could either express that very honestly and say, I'm having a crap day. I'm not really excited about being here, just so everyone knows. Or I could say, you know what? Maybe my class needs me to be a little bit excited today. So I'm going to hold that back, and I'm going to be as excited as possible on the exterior, because I think that will get more out of students. And I'm saying, as a teacher, I'm going to go with the latter. I'm not going to go with the former. So that's where I think I part ways with Rogers. What do you think, Marsha?
He provides a good example. Sorry. Miss Shield writes how at times the classroom would get really messy and it would drive her crazy and she hated it. And then at one point, I guess maybe this kind of models your feeling of when you're having a crap day versus putting on a good face. And Miss Shields told them, she said, look, you guys, maybe it doesn't bother you, but I really value having a clean classroom. And is there a way that we can do something about it? And the students came up with a solution to that. And they acknowledged her feelings and her needs. And, they're the ones who came up with the solution. And it's, I think he mentions, or Miss Shields mentions that, these solutions are often things that we wouldn't come up with, on our own, but when they're entrusted to the group, they find, a really innovative way to acknowledge and meet each other's needs. I don't know if that addresses that same kind of motivational issue, though, but I think that's an instance where she was honest and it was fruitful. But I'm sorry, you were going to say something, Marsha.
Oh, no. Well, no, what you said was great, Liz, and I think it fits perfectly with Kevin's question, because I think in Kevin's case, if he's feeling bad someday, but he wants the class to have an exciting class, it might be really fruitful for him to say, I really feel bad today, but I want you guys to have a great experience. So what can we do together to make that possible? And it's surprising how they will respond to your human situation and actually possibly help it and help you feel better, so that you can then go on and be the enthusiastic teacher without having to put on a show.
Is there value to doing that versus value? So if I have the choice between doing what you said, which I think is a pretty good kind of way to handle it, versus not saying anything at all and being like, I don't even need to tell students I'm having a bad day. Why would I do that? Do you think there's value to going your course or going the more honest course versus really saying, no, maybe my students just need me to be positive today?
Oh, I think there's a lot of value, and in fact, in the chapter where Rogers is talking about facilitating his own class, if you recall, the students who are all psychology students end up having an experience of tremendous growth and almost relief because they're able to express themselves and what they're really thinking and feeling, and then they get close to the other people. They feel accepted and they feel encouraged by those other people, and that all adds to the energy of learning, and kind of a group enthusiasm comes out of it, that an energy comes out of it that you won't get if you are just trying to create all the energy yourself and it's out of an acting job, you're just not going to get the same results.
Okay. So I want to push this a little bit more, because I feel like a lot of what we've talked about in terms of, how Ms. Shields did it, and Marsha's suggestion about what, if you're having a bad day, how to kind of frame that in an honest way. I feel like a lot of that is the sort of like honesty, where it's the kind of honesty where you can work it out in the end, where no feelings would get hurt, like really, like, but what about a situation that may be more consequential, like a student does a project and I'm like, I'm really not impressed by your project. I don't like it. I don't think your project is very good. Is there a teacherly responsibility to put that forth, or to hold back on it? Because that may be the kind of thing where the question is honesty versus possibly hurting someone's feelings within the class and possibly destroying momentum that they have.
Well, the issue is you can be honest about the quality of what you're seeing, but by being very specific and factual, pointing out where the writing, saying, well, now you said this in this sentence, and I don't understand what that means, and what do these words mean, and focusing very much on the fact of what the person did and whether the fact of what they did actually lived up to their own goal, versus you telling them, I think this is terrible, because then you're injecting this emotional, interpersonal judgment into the situation that's not really necessary and actually destructive to them focusing on what they're doing and improving on what they're doing. Was I clear on what the difference?
Yeah, I think so. I wish I had quotes with me about what Rogers means by honesty, but he really stresses like emotional honesty, though. He's like, if I'm having an emotion during a therapy session, and I have the choice to express it or not, I should express it. So I think like what you're saying is express it in a way where they can really understand the factual basis of it or whatever. But there's also an emotional basis. Like, I react negatively to your project. I do not like it.
Well, Roger says that kind of thing, but that's not, if you watch the way he does therapy, he believes that you have to have several conditions for good therapy that in a certain sense are in tension with each other. And so you have to keep your goal in mind, and then you want to be authentic, which is what you're talking about, but you always also want to be supportive of the person. So those two things are in tension, and you have to find a solution to that where you're able to actually somewhat, in other words, when you're pointing out all of the things that's wrong with the person's paper, you're in that respect expressing, your thoughts about it without putting a lot of negative judgment on him as a person.
Right.
So I think Rogers is not the guy who's sitting there telling you. He's not Fritz Perls, who was another guy who ran a lot of encounter groups, who would just tell you, I'm really mad at you and you this and that, so it's a different kind of being honest.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah.
I think
Well,
he provides an example. Sorry, when he a student in one of his classes self-evaluated himself and gave him an A, and Rogers sincerely felt that he didn't deserve it, and he, I think, came back to the student and told him, well, you know what, I think, like, on reflection of like what your goals were and what and the work that you produced, like, I don't feel comfortable giving you an A, and I feel more comfortable giving you a B. And he asked the student to think about it, and then if the student disagreed, maybe they could talk more about it. But I think in the end, the student reflected and said, yeah, B is probably more accurate for what I put into it. So I think that's one way he kind of had that, or expressed that, but I feel like it is kind of a delicate thing, and difficult to be honest, but that also requires honesty on both the part of the student and the teacher.
Right. Yeah, that's, well, let's move to kind of the last question to see things out for this video. I was curious about, in some ways, kind of negative reactions to this sort of freedom from students. So in Ms. Shields' case, I don't think there were negative reactions, but there were students who she said really were not prepared to use freedom very well. So she had to have a more restrictive condition. So some students would get to do kind of the things they wanted to do, but other students who, in her opinion, were really just taking advantage of it were in a more structured environment until they and she felt that they were ready to move on. And then in Professor Fa's class, they go on to reveal certain, I guess, course evaluations for students. And one of the, a few of the evaluations were negative. And there's one in particular that kind of stands out to me. It's on page 48. It says, find the one I'm looking for.
It's the third paragraph. Well,
oh, that's right. There it is. As for making my own goals the dominant feature of the course, I felt the instructor should set the goals. He knows the materials and what should be learned by the student. When I try to analyze my own goals, I was completely frustrated. And the reason that stands out to me is because recently I've had the experience of having a much more freedom-focused course, a student-centered course, and I got several evaluations to that effect. I got, you know, a few negative evaluations about, well, I don't feel like the professor really did anything. It's like the professor's job to like know this stuff and teach it to me. I feel like I'm not getting what I paid for because I paid so the professor can teach stuff. And you know, I don't want to dismiss those criticisms. Sometimes I feel like Rogers in his analysis was kind of dismissive of those criticisms, and I don't want to be dismissive of it because there may be a point there. So what do you think about that? Because I know, Marsha, I think you've said you've gotten similar, you know, feedback about, you know, like I feel like the teacher's job is to do more, and I don't see the teacher doing more here. So what do y'all think of that kind of feedback? I mean, Liz from the student perspective, Marsha from the teacher perspective.
Well, is it a question of like being conditioned to a point where like you're not used to this kind of freedom, so you don't really know what to do? So I know as a student who never really had that freedom and being introduced to that, yeah, you kind of approach it with a lot of trepidation. And I think maybe the negative reaction students have is that it really puts the responsibility on you as a student, and you become responsible for your own learning. So in that sense, like failing changes, and also like you have to find a direction, you have to decide what you want. You know, that's a big responsibility. So like part of it is, I think, the disposition of the learner at that point. I think one of the negative reactions, or like one of the student feedbacks from Carl Rogers' class is that, well, if you want to be a passive learner, then this is not kind of the structure for you. And some people do want that. They want to be comfortable with that. But I think maybe what Rogers would ask is that, well, is that the optimal way for them to learn? Like maybe it's what's comfortable, but will they actually learn as much as they would in a different kind of method? I don't know. I think that's a valid question.
you know, when I read comments like this from somebody, I feel very sad, because it means that the person doesn't seem to know whether they have their own interests and goals. They're just seem to be personally organized entirely by external forces, right? And it also reminds me, I didn't mention earlier, but I have a long history in Montessori education. I started a Montessori school 27 years ago. It goes from 3 years old to 8th grade. And it's interesting because so often people will come into a Montessori school, and even though the children are all working very hard and enthusiastically, their complaint will be, well, there's not enough structure. And I think it's ironic because a Montessori school actually has a lot more structure than a traditional school where everybody's sitting in desks doing the same thing at the same time. But the structure is, in a certain sense, behind the scenes, and that's what the teacher is creating, both the physical environment and the psychological and the social and the intellectual environment. And that's what you're doing, Kevin, when you're doing your classes. And it's unfortunate that these students don't see that you're putting a lot of thought into how to structure the situation so that they can learn better. I mean, maybe in some respect, if you can educate them about that, they might be more appreciative. Although I don't have a lot of optimism for certain kinds of people who have followed a history of just following along with what other people want them to do. They've conformed themselves so much that they really don't know what their own desires and goals are. But even them, sometimes they can turn around too.
Right. So I have what I like to call, it's based on a language I heard from Mike Munger, the political scientist, that we have what I like to call a labor theory of teaching and learning. The labor theory of learning is that if it doesn't feel like work, it's not learning. So the more work you feel like you're doing, the more learning you're doing. And if you're not doing work, if it's play, you're not really learning. That's why people never say, like, when you go and you learn some more about gardening, you don't say, I learned a ton about gardening today. When we talk about learning, we talk about math class, because math class is effort, work. And then we have the same thing about teaching. We have the same assumption about teaching. Like, the amount of teaching that you do is proportional to the amount of obvious teaching that it looks like you're doing. So if you're not doing a lot of teaching in front of the classroom, like, it won't look like you're teaching. I always like to say that it's kind of, I think we're used to the labor theory of teaching and learning in those senses. But I still want to, like, think about, I mean, I know Rousseau didn't mean it like this, but when he said, you know, you force people to be free, in some ways, is that what Rogers is kind of doing? Is saying, like, if you're not comfortable with this, if you're not comfortable with being, like, free in this classroom, I'm not going to accommodate you. I'll accommodate you if you want to, you know, learn kind of in an autodidactic way. Like, I'll accommodate that, but I will not accommodate you. Because Ms. Shields did accommodate those people. But it seems like the Rogers approach is more like, no, I'm not going to accommodate that.
Maybe that's where he's being honest.
Right. If you're not comfortable with this kind of class, I'm not the professor for you. And we shouldn't look down on that. Maybe really, you know, you would be better somewhere else, and that's fine.
Well, I think maybe this is just from what I read of his other work, but I think he sincerely believes that if people were given enough chance and enough time in an environment where they feel accepted and free to speak and be themselves, that everybody could eventually learn through this method and learn to enjoy it. But I think as a precondition for his course, he laid out, well, this is what the course entails, and this is what's going to be expected of you. And so if you want to abide by this, then, you know, you should stay in this class. But if this is not something you want to do, then maybe, like, take another course. So in that situation, the choice is still up to the student. So they know fully before signing up, this is what it's going to be like. But I don't know, I just feel like, you know, forcing people to be free is so anti-Rogers to me because he's so non-coercive in his method.
You know, I was thinking and reading about the response of this person and some of the other ones that didn't like his methodology. It reminds me of children that sometimes we take into a Montessori school who have been in traditional school for a while, and how difficult a time they have in the beginning. Some of them get comfortable right away. They should have been in a Montessori school all along, but there's other ones where at first they are like fish flopping about out of water, right? And they don't know what to do. The freedom is too much for them. They goof around. They don't work. And it might take quite a while to get them to see that they could actually become invested in work and enjoy it. So I feel like that's the case with these students that he's mentioning in the book here. It would just take a longer time with them for him to sensitively, and I'm sure he would, sensitively talk to them about themselves in a way that he could get them to maybe be more aware of their own interests, or what direction they might, or find something that would actually engage their own personal interest, and then they have that first taste of what it's like to follow your own interests.
Right. Yeah, I've seen similar things about the Sudbury models of school, interviews with Dan Greenberg, who's the founder of Sudbury Valley School in Massachusetts, which is a very free school in terms of what they can do. And he says in his experience, young kids adapt very quickly to not being told what to do because it's kind of natural for them. He said that the longer you've been in a traditional school, the longer your adjustment period to this model will generally be. Because, and it goes back to what I said earlier in the conversation, which is the first few weeks I have to kind of convince students to believe me that no, I'm really not trying to set expectations for you and just not giving those to you. I really mean that I will adapt your expectations. And it's, if you've been taught that there are expectations, to hear that they're not, your first thought is going to be, well, there probably are, they're not telling them to me. They want me to guess them or whatever. But yeah.
Well, you know, the only exception to what you said about how long, what Greenberg said about how long it takes students to adjust, is the student who's been in traditional school and been very frustrated with it and never gone along with it. Then when they get freedom, then they suck it up right away and they learn. And unless they've gotten into so many bad habits of resistance, they've gotten into so many bad habits of resistance that they think, I have to do that here too, you know. So then that becomes a longer case.
Right. So I think that's probably a good spot to wrap it up. So we'll obviously post this video up, and then we'll do the next video, which is the more theoretical section. So the next section, part 2, he makes a more theoretical case for what do we mean by freedom? Why is freedom a good thing in learning? He talks about things like the methods of building freedom in a classroom, the methods of getting people used to it, things like that. So Marsha, Liz, thank you very much for sitting down and talking about part 1. And again, for readers, for viewers, this is Freedom to Learn by Carl Rogers. If you haven't gotten the book, hopefully we've inspired you to look at it. And if you have, hopefully you're finding this to be enlightening. So thank you both for sitting down today.
Thank you for organizing it, Kevin.